Hello, everybody. Caleb and Jen again, bringing you Acts 27 today. Jen's going to kick us off reading.
So we're going to start in verse 9, but real quick for context, this is right after Paul has had his very dramatic trial in front of Festus and King Agrippa, and he appealed to Caesar to go be tried by Caesar in Rome. So they're traveling from Antioch all the way across the Mediterranean Sea to Rome. So, verse 9, much time had already been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also. But the centurion, who was in charge of Paul, instead of listening to what Paul said, he followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor on the island of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. So, the Day of Atonement, that takes place, according to my Bible, sometime in early September. Late September. And so at this point, they're already at the end of September, mid-October. The Romans considered it doubtful to sail after September 15th and pretty much suicidal to sail after November 11th. So they're right in that shady gray area where they can decide, all right, we're going to sail, but we have to keep an eye on the weather and we have to really hope for good weather if we want our goals to succeed. And Paul, he says, no, this is going to be a disaster. It's not going to work out. He's probably been praying this entire time, and he's probably heard this from the Holy Spirit. But the people in charge of him, they don't believe in God. They don't know God. They especially don't know God like Paul does. So they're not going to listen to him. They're only concerned about their profits and getting to Rome at a suitable time, perhaps so that they can book it back to the eastern side of the Mediterranean early in the spring, as soon as it's suitable to sail again, to optimize all of their profits. They don't care about safety or anything. They just want the money, so they opt to go on ahead.
So, my only thing that I want to kind of add to this was it's interesting how previously Paul has been with this centurion for a while, and at this point the centurion opts to not listen to Paul, and that's kind of the mistake of which path do you opt for, and he obviously ended up choosing the incorrect one. But to think that a lot of this next part could have been avoided just on a choice, it boils down to that action. So I'm going to pick up on verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of a hurricane force, called the Northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, is what I'm going to call it, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Cyprus. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither the sun nor the stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So I'm going to pause right there and just kind of talk about just what they really did. They just gave up a lot of goods to hope that they keep on. And it kind of is reminiscent of the story of Jonah, on how they were throwing things overboard just to stay afloat and to lighten the ship. And so I looked up the word what it means to throw the ship's tackle overboard, and that's usually a lot of the finer furniture. It's the stuff that would be in the captain's quarters. It's items that are not cheap at all, but it's not the cargo that's promised to somebody else that's going to make them the profit. So it's taking a loss for the short-term gain. So do you want to continue on with?
Sure. So in verse 21, Verse 21 starts out as, after they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So this is where I think Paul starts gaining respect on the ship. Remember, he is still a prisoner. He's bottom of the totem pole. No one really cares about him. He's not a sailor. He doesn't know what's going on. He has no stake in the profits at hand. But he stands before everybody anyway, very boldly, and he addresses every single one of them. He's in tune with the Holy Spirit. He speaks exactly what God has told him and what God has told him to do. And he speaks with authority. And so this is where he starts gaining the respect of the crew and of the centurion. So I'll let Caleb start reading verse 27, where they actually do have the shipwreck.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight the sailors sensed we were approaching land. They took surroundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later they took soundings again and found it as 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea. Pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow, then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboats and let it drift away. Here I think is another one of those instances where the centurion had a choice, and after his first mistake, it's like, oh, this guy Paul has authority. He has this Holy Spirit, he has God on his side and is favoring him. So we're cutting the lifeboats. We are cutting, letting these boats drift away. I think that's a huge note to kind of make and kind of just almost relish. It's like this guy's now coming to realize the power of Paul. Do you want me to continue with 33?
Sure.
All right. Just before dawn, Paul urged them to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there was 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So this is now the third time that they've thrown things into the sea to lighten the load. And this is now their profits that they are pretty much saying goodbye to and saying, okay, we're taking our lives and we're going to just pretty much continue on with them rather than the money that they would have made from this trip. They're saying goodbye to all of that.
So in verse 39, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So I think here, in the first couple of verses, verse 39, they're still doing everything they can nautically to save the ship. They still don't want to believe that they're going to lose everything except for their own lives. There's a whole lot of nautical terminology in this chapter that I cannot keep up with. I don't understand it whatsoever. I just know, oh, they're trying to lighten the ship and they're trying to avoid the rocks and avoid a shipwreck. But everything that Paul said came to pass. Everything that God told Paul would happen, happened. And through this, the centurion gained, like, he respected Paul, saved Paul's life, therefore saved all the other prisoners' lives, and not a single hair was lost from the heads of all 276 men on board. They shipwrecked, but they were alive, and that's so much more important than any profit. So to wrap it up, I think the coolest parts of this for us were just seeing how boldly and courageously Paul stepped up and spoke with authority to people who are way above him status-wise. God granted Paul favor with all of those who were in authority over him. And God saved the lives of an entire ship through Paul, because Paul was willing to listen to him, and Paul was willing to not only speak about his faith, but act on it. So I think that's a good challenge for us too, is we can trust God to follow through on his word, and we can speak the truth about him. We can speak what he tells us to, because he will follow through on his word.
Well, thank you all for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again soon.